Good evening and welcome to the 18 December 2025 edition of the Naval Order of the United States virtual lecture series. Since we began in 2020, we've recorded over 70 presentations, which you can view at the Commandery's YouTube channel. The QR code that I'm showing here is for the Naval Order, a place where you can learn about the Naval Order of the United States, and the link to the Commandery's YouTube channel is located on the website. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I will say a few words about the Naval Order of the United States. The Naval Order is our nation's oldest ancestral organization that's dedicated to the preservation and promotion of awareness of our nation's maritime history. Specifically, our mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate U.S. maritime history and to promote camaraderie amongst our companions. Anyone who has served in one of our maritime services or is a spouse or direct descendant of a maritime service veteran is eligible to join. Again, for more information, use the QR code at the top left of the screen to go to www.navalorder.org and select how to join NOAA. Today's presentation is being recorded on YouTube and will be available for viewing immediately after the program has ended. Those of you on line stream already have the URL. That URL will probably change in about 2 weeks as we migrate the recording to join its partners on the Continental Commandery's YouTube page. That page itself will be changing as it becomes the Naval Order's YouTube page. I know that sounds complicated. Watch your All NOAA broadcast and my LinkedIn posts to guide you through the process as needed. During the presentation, I invite you to ask questions in the comments block. At the end of Mr. Kruger's presentation, I will ask him the questions that you have posted. Now my pleasure to reintroduce Mr. Damon Kruger, who was our speaker, as you may recall, in October. He presented part one of his presentation about the life and times of the USS Confederacy, Connecticut'S naval frigate. He's back with us to complete that presentation. Mr. Kruger earned his Bachelor of Arts in History at the Hillside College and his Master's in History from Colorado State. He's a nationally recognized scholar of military history, primarily focused in the era of the American Revolution. Some of you may have heard this year we celebrated the 250th anniversaries of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And next year we anticipate celebrating the 250th anniversary of something else. What might that be? So we look forward to another year of celebrations. He received the National Society of the Daughters of American Republic History Award in 2021 for his many important contributions to early American history. Damien, welcome back. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Fred. Thanks for that great introduction. And you know, it's great as the grandson of a career Marine officer who served from 1926 to 1956 to be a member of the Naval Order. And then my mom, his daughter, served as a Navy nurse in the late 50s and early 60s, including at Bethesda Naval Hospital. So being a companion of the Naval Order means a lot to me. So thanks for having me back for part two.
Great to have you. And I did neglect to mention that you are a member of our Newport Commandery. And that's where we first met when I visited the Commandery last March, if I recall.
Yes.
We're coming up on the time I promised to get off stage. And so without further ado, I'm going to give you the deck and the con, and we'll move backstage as you present part two for the saga of the USS Confederacy.
Thank you, Fred. So this presentation picks up where the last one left off, but a couple of the things I want to do is just sort of revisit a few things near the end of the presentation from October, just to refresh people's memories. And if you had just watched the previous episode in the recent past, or you were to watch this in the future, then it's a good bridge for me to do this. And in this chilly weather, while I'm dressed for the impending Christmas, 12 days of Christmas and Christmas holiday with my bright red, it's chilly out there, especially here in the Northeast. But I thought we would warm our thoughts with thoughts of tropical islands like Martinique, pictured there on the left, one of the French colonial islands and still owned by France. In fact, France still has its French naval headquarters for the Caribbean, right where the USS Confederacy will spend some time in its interesting journey, we'll say. So one of the things I just really want to remind people of is what the ship looked like as it's heading out to sea. This is one of the better models, and it's a model that happens to be located just about a mile or two from here at my house. I'm speaking to you from the General Jedediah Huntington house that my wife and I feel so lucky to proudly own in Norwich, Connecticut. And just a quick recall that one of the reasons I got interested in the USS Confederacy is that it was built about 4 miles south of here, and that the naval agent who represented, basically served as a liaison between U.S. Congress and the local authorities and the shipwrights and the shipyard, was none other than Joshua Huntington, who had been a militia colonel earlier in the war and was now switching roles in helping oversee this project to build one of the frigates for the Continental Navy. And his house is behind our house here. So this model is at the Slater Museum at Norwich Free Academy. It's the largest model I've yet seen of the ship. There are 5 different kinds of models I've seen. This is a custom built model that is fully rigged, made in the 1960s. And then here's an image I just discovered this summer. It's amazing. Even though I've done research on the USS Confederacy for almost 10 years, and at times with the assistance of my friend and fellow scholar and author, Dane Rue, who runs the Slater Museum. He's the director of the Slater Museum here in Norwich. And I helped him with his creation of a Confederacy display at the Slater Museum, where he's the director. And it's one of only 2 high schools in the United States to have an art museum on campus, the other one being in Exeter, New Hampshire. It's amazing the journey you have when you discover new images. And this one is taken from a book, a coffee table book by Nolan Van Powell. He was a famed, distinguished art historian, but really an oil painter, naval painter, who unfortunately died before the bicentennial was over. And that's really unfortunate. But he did a lot of these paintings in 1973, 74 through maybe around 78. He was in Tennessee, and this is one of several paintings he did at the Confederacy. This one showing it taking on stores in the port of Philadelphia. So you may recall from the end of the last presentation, the Confederacy leaves the Thames River and the port of New London in southeastern Connecticut, right by Groton. And of course, you think of the sub base and the Coast Guard Academy and electric boat, depending on your service or your family service. And then it had sails out past Montauk and the Eastern Hamptons, and deploys south to the Philadelphia area. And this is where it's taking on supplies at the port of Philadelphia in the fall of 1779. And it's awaiting orders, and the orders are quite interesting. Now, it will initially go out to sea to serve in a small convoy with the Silas Deane, or the Dean, which is named for the diplomat from Wethersfield, Connecticut, Silas Deane. This is a painting, again, by Nolan Van Powell, also painted in the 1970s. Beautiful dramatic scene with an under sail and another frigate in the background. It'll pass Cape May and head out to sea and capture a couple ships. So unfortunately, this ship is known as maybe the most beautiful, yet most unlucky ship of the Continental Navy in the American Revolution. And yet what gets overshadowed because of what happens eventually to the ship is that it actually was successful in either capturing ships on its own or as part of a convoy with other ships, such as the Saratoga and or the Dean and other frigates. Later in 1779, at this point, it's basically November, Congress had basically assigns Captain Seth Harding, the skipper of the USS Confederacy, and the ship to do a very special mission. And it's diplomatic convoy, basically, to deliver John Jay, the VIP, along with his attractive wife, Sarah Livingston Jay. Now, she is the daughter of Governor William Livingston of New Jersey, who will later be a signer of the U.S. Constitution and a Supreme Court Chief Justice. And then, in addition to that, you have Gerard, the minister to Spain, Conrad Alexander Gerard, who had served as the first minister from France. He has to be brought back to Europe as well. So Jay is going to leave his seat as president of the Congress of the United States to be succeeded by a neighbor of ours here in Norwich, Samuel Huntington. And Jay will be the first representative of the United States to Spain. So if you have someone who has to get to Spain and the other person has to get to France, well, where's the ship supposed to go? That Congress leaves up to Seth Harding at his discretion. When he arrives somewhere off the European coast, he is to decide whether it will be one port versus another, either in Spain or France, given the weather conditions and what they encounter along the way. Another part of the orders is do not engage any other ships. Try to avoid any contact with any Royal Navy ships or any ships of any kind. Don't try to capture anything, because your mission is to deliver these VIPs as quickly and safely as possible. And it's another one of these themes that I have in both my first book and what will be my second book that will come out in a couple of years. And that is the theme of partnership and patriotism between, in this case, the United States and France, but also Spain, because Spain is the new ally that follows France into relations with the patriotic side of the United States in its war against Great Britain. So Sarah Livingston Jay is an important person. Not only is she the daughter of the governor of New Jersey, but it's her letters that tell us a lot about what happens aboard the USS Confederacy when it heads out to sea. Initially, in December 79, when it leaves and it's heading east, the passengers are, quote, very commodiously settled, end quote, on board. And she was taking French lessons each day. This is the first 10 days of the journey with Conrad Gerard. And apparently they got along quite well. And she was quite the fun socialite. Unfortunately, as I mentioned at the end of my last presentation, after it set sail on the 26th of October, about 10 days into the journey, it is dismasted. And based on what we know, it is basically out in the middle of the North Atlantic, middle of nowhere. And the first thing that sprung was the bowsprit and then the other mast. So that as one mast collapsed, then it created a sort of deck of cards effect, or a domino effect, if you will. Now, if that weren't enough, you'll hear other things that were a challenge. But I want to bring up here this concept of Admiralty ship models, because in case you don't know, an Admiralty ship model is a model that has no masts, rigging, or sails. The point of it is to show, of course, the shape and the structure of the ship, especially the hull. And here's an example. And this particular Admiralty model is of the USS Confederacy. And I have a model about 10 feet away from me off my left shoulder that is similar to this model. This one's even more detailed, a different kit. But the idea of an Admiralty model comes from the Royal Admiralty in the 1600s, the British Royal Admiralty. And then it expands into other countries like France, the rest of Europe, and of course, eventually the United States. And the intent, of course, is that the Royal Navy wants to determine how this ship is going to look. Is the shape going to be one that they like, the way it's structured, and so forth? The Confederacy in particular was a very beautiful ship meant to impress the French, because by 1779, we know that we're going to be having French coming on board, and we want to be able to impress them with what we can construct. So it was a beautiful ship, but unfortunately had some really tough luck later in the war. Note that there are two sets of open ports running across there. Obviously, there's the ports for the cannons, but then what makes this ship so unusual, it's the last of its kind. Apparently, there had been occasionally this hybrid effect of having a galley frigate. In other words, a frigate of, say, around 32 to 36 guns. By the way, the Confederacy was rated for 36. It often only actually had about 30 cannons on board, because cannons were hard to come by for the Continental Navy for a number of reasons. But then you have the second lower row closer to the waterline, and that, of course, is the ports for this role of it as a galley for temporary use, likely in ports when it's trying to turn in tight spaces or make its way up and down rivers against currents and times when there's no wind. The British were fascinated by this design, as we'll find out later. It's a bit of a spoiler. So unfortunately, we don't have a better image than this. This is the best I can get. It is from a book, a biography of Captain Seth Harding. And the biographer back in 1930 wanted to show with a pencil. He did a homemade drawing. And this is the best lit that we can get as I try to adjust the image. And you can see it's basically quite a distance southeast of Newfoundland. So there's an officers' meeting aboard the Confederacy. What do we do? Because in addition to the bowsprit and the three masts, you'll notice right away there in the upper right, the rudder has snapped. And they realized that is the most critical thing of all. They were able to, within 24 to 36 hours, to jerry-rig, sails and smaller masts. They had some backup smaller stuff that they could use to jerry-rig. But the problem was, how do you deal with this rudder that has snapped, that is banging against the stern of the ship and causing damage, and to the point where there's water coming in the stern in the hold? That's a dangerous situation, and it meant that they were basically bobbing around like a cork for almost 2 weeks as they were drifting east towards Europe, and they knew it was going to be too dangerous. The Royal Navy would immediately capture this bobbing cork at sea. So they said, we've got to turn. We have to head southwest, they determined in this officers' meeting, and limp all the way southwest to Martinique. Hard to believe, and they make it. And it's a testament to not only Captain Seth Harding, but all the skilled people aboard, the ship's carpenter, the officers, the sailors, and the Marines who helped. And the tricky part was getting the sailors into boats into the stern of the ship, in these boats, trying to run chains to keep the stern from completely snapping off. And that was something that they had to repeat several times because of the stress on those chains. Here is the French island of Martinique to get us a general familiarity. You can see the geology and geography more easily on the left, and we'll get into that momentarily. The key here is that there's a town called St. Pierre, or port city, in the upper left corner that is basically right here. It's right above where it says Caribbean Sea on the map on the right. That's where the USS Confederacy will first go into. And then there's the more important Fort de France, which to this day is the headquarters for, like I said, the French Navy in the Caribbean. Note that both the ports are on the western side of the island. The eastern side, for whatever reason, rockier, more shallow, doesn't have the natural ports apparently. So just to give you the general flavor of what Martinique would look like nowadays, as well as back then, just different development, of course, but the geography hasn't changed. And of course, right away, your eyes are locking on this volcano. It is a volcanic island. And that is Mount Pelée, which of course means bald mountain. It's roughly 4,580 feet high. It did erupt. It's an active volcano. It erupted in 1902. And as you can see, it killed 30,000 people in several minutes. And it was the worst volcano eruption in the 20th century. Thankfully, it last erupted in 1932. So fingers crossed for residents and guests to the island. Must have been an impressive sight for the crew of the Confederacy to see as they approached. And what a timely arrival for them as they arrived on December 18th, 1779, limping into the port of St. Pierre. What is taking place right off over the horizon, or on the horizon, is 13 British ships fighting 3 French warships and 26 French merchant ships. 10 or 11 of those French merchant ships will be captured by the Royal Navy, while the rest managed to escape. Thankfully, no one took notice of this American ship limping in. Of course, had it gotten any closer to the naval action, if the naval action had been closer to St. Pierre, it would have been captured quickly by the British. There's also a French painting of a similar battle that'll take place off the coast of Martinique. This is actually an event that takes place in 1781. And this is not directly related to the Confederacy, so I won't blow the painting up. But if we were to enlarge it, there's all kinds of detail in the background and the foreground, including the natives from Martinique, the black slaves, and the various French officers and their wives and the soldiers manning the batteries. So after they've arrived at the port of St. Pierre, John Jay's first concern is for the officers. He knows that this ship is unlucky. He's only going to be in Martinique for 3 days, by the way, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in those 3 days that he's in Martinique with his family and Comte Gerard, he expresses his concern that the U.S. officers had no money, that they couldn't, for example, pay for the French wine that was provided by the hosts, which were largely French officers there at the island. And so Jay had Ben Franklin send him money that was taken out of Jay's own salary, roughly 100 pounds, to pay the officers. What a gentleman he was. And Jay wrote these letters to Congress, where they were meeting, of course, in Philadelphia, before he departs 3 days later with Sarah Livingston Jay, his wife, of course, and Comte Gerard, his wife, and then, of course, their aides. By the way, one of John Jay's aides, or his personal secretary, was Henry Brockholst Livingston, who will later himself become a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's quite an entourage. The other source that we have for what had happened to the Confederacy at sea, but it's also when it's in dock, when it's in the ports of St. Pierre and Fort-de-France in Martinique, is this journal of Joseph Hardy. And luckily, myself, my wife, and again, my aforementioned colleague and friend, Dane Rue, we made a special appointment. I made the special appointment for the three of us to go see the journal. We held it in our hands from 1779 into 1780 at the Mystic Seaport Museum's research archives. It's amazing. And the guy's handwriting is just incredible. He looks like he could have been the scribe for the U.S. Constitution. And a lot of the things that it covers, things like how John Jay helped when the VIPs left the island, which was, as I said, 3 days later aboard a French ship, the nature and the stages in which the Confederacy was repaired. And of course, he makes all kinds of observations about what a lot of them are seen as an exotic island, including its weather, culture, and wildlife. And of course, then there's it's the military. So there's challenges with the ship's discipline. And we're talking, nothing's changed about the U.S. government, whether it's 1779, 1979, and now. So there are delays from Congress, and there's challenges with financing and trying to get these repairs made to the ship. Some of the selections from Hardy's diary are rather colorful. So here is what I would call the taste of observations. The 12th of January in 1780, a diary reads, quote, "Several of the seamen, having liberty to go ashore in the afternoon, returned on board, much intoxicated with liquor, and in consequence of it, like all sailors, began to grumble at their wages, and instead of being sent to St. Lucie to be exchanged, they were joined by several who was taken out of English privateers, and in several minutes the whole ship appeared in a flame of mutiny. The ringleaders were immediately confined in irons, hand and feet, and some of the most," what he meant to say, he says obstropolous, he means obstreperous, meaning unruly, hard to control, "were gagged, which soon cooled them down. However, they were kept in confinement all night." Then there's another entry. He says, at the careenage off the French naval base at Fort Royal, Hardy writes, quote, "Tuesday, 25th July, 1781. Heavy rains with smart squalls of wind. Employed 4 French carpenters at work on the lower yards. Procured a spar this afternoon to splice the foremast. The barge returned in the evening from St. Pierre's with 2 large spars. Having left our purser there, very sick with a fever. We are informed a Philadelphia brig arrived at St. Pierre yesterday in distress, having met with severe weather on the coast of America, from where she was driven off and lost her topmasts. She was last from Calais. 2 of our people taken with severe fits this evening. The fifer tumbled overboard and had nearly been drowned. A man tumbled into the mainhold without receiving much injury, and one of the sentries tumbled off the gangway in upon the deck. I believe, and you see the space there, and of course, who he's referring to is the devil. I believe the devil got aboard tonight. The whole ship seemed to be in a tumult all evening. And the final selection I'll read to you. On the 27th of February, 1780, the captain records, quote, "At Meridian, the man who last night attempted to run away and being the ringleader of this scheme was publicly whipped at the gangway by order of the captain," of course, Seth Harding. "This first regular punishment that has been inflicted on any of these ships' crew for this common crime, which will have a good effect provided there is a continuance of it." Now, the person who, from the United States, welcomed the Confederacy when it arrived was the American agent to Martinique, and he was from Philadelphia. So he was very familiar with Congress meeting in Philadelphia, having been born and raised there and living there most of the rest of his life. And that is William Bingham. William Bingham was quite a distinguished merchant. He's an American statesman, and he's a wealthy merchant from Philadelphia, as you can see from his fine clothing and these beautiful portraits. He's one of the richest men in the United States during the 1780s. Many of you have heard of Robert Morris, and so he rivals Robert Morris for wealth in Philadelphia. He will later in life serve as a U.S. Senator. He serves as an advisor to Alexander Hamilton when Hamilton is creating the Department of the Treasury, including how to create the first bank of the United States. In fact, William Bingham's wife's father is the first president of the Bank of the United States. And because of his tremendous wealth, William Bingham, living there at the time in Martinique, years later will commission the famous Gilbert Stuart to paint what we know as the Lansdowne portrait, because it winds up with this member of parliament named Lansdowne over in Britain. But it was actually William Bingham who had commissioned the portrait of George Washington that is similar to the one you see here. This one here is of William Bingham himself. And then there's one similar like it of George Washington. And there were many copies of these made, painted, repainted by Gilbert Stuart over the coming years. So the Confederacy eventually is going to get back onto the ocean. Now, the problem is the French had some masts available, but any masts they had of good quality had to be, understandably, first priority was to have those used for repairs to the French ships because you're in a French port. So the Confederacy is given temporary masts just so that it can basically sail effectively from Martinique back to Philadelphia, where it'll get a more proper full refitting and repairs. Now, there had been a change in the French leadership in March, a change in French strategy with how to handle Martinique and the Caribbean operations. And Captain Harding and the Confederacy almost fought in a naval battle with the French fleet against the Royal Navy or British fleet. But at the last minute, the Confederacy and Harding were given a letter by a dispatcher, and they were called back to the harbor by the aforementioned William Bingham. And so it avoids this battle. But the battle would have been here in April 1780s. It says 20 Royal Navy ships of the line versus 23 French ships of the line. So that's a considerably large naval battle. And it features the famous Admiral George Rodney of the Royal Navy facing off against Lieutenant General. Yes, the French Navy used the term Lieutenant General des Armes Navales, Comte de Guichen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And here is a depiction of this battle in a painting. There are several. This is one example by Roussel de Courcerce, painted years later, 1789, at the Musée National de la Marine in Paris, their Naval History Museum. And like I said, the United States Confederacy, the USS Confederacy, eventually is able to return to Philadelphia. And again, we rely on Joseph Hardy's journal as a resource for how it does this. And how it makes its journey. It leaves Martinique on April 20th, following that second major battle that had taken place, as I mentioned, several days earlier. It does eventually return to Philadelphia. It does get refitted with new spars and rigging. Unfortunately, those are going to have issues, especially the rigging. And in addition to that, apparently the rope wasn't of good quality. When it headed back out to sea, it had a big problem with the quality of the rope. The other issue is that it also had been damaged in a collision while at anchor with another ship. So this was more bad luck for the Confederacy. And then it's tasked to transport the Continental Army stores from Cape Francis, Haiti, Cape Francois. So it sails on December 21st, 1780, out of Philadelphia. And the idea is it's supposed to bring the Continental Army stores, of course, back to the United States. So it heads down towards the Caribbean. 5 days out, the mainmast is badly damaged. So they think they've got these brand new masts that they had in Philadelphia that would work for years. And yet this one is already badly damaged just a few days out at sea. So more temporary repairs are made. It arrives in Haiti on January 8th. And again, we know this because of the diary of Joseph Hardy, the captain of the Marines, not to be confused with Captain Seth Harding, who's the skipper of the ship. And they're in Haiti. They're going to load up some cargo and several passengers, and they're supposed to return back to Philadelphia. By the way, I should have mentioned that when the Confederacy left Martinique back in April of 1780, it did bring William Bingham, another VIP journey, William Bingham back to Philadelphia, where he could resume his relations with Congress. So the Confederacy will never return to Philadelphia in 1781 on this second journey from the Caribbean back up to Philly. And that's because in April 14, 1781, it encounters two Royal Navy ships, the 44-gun HMS Roebuck and the 32-gun HMS Orpheus. They engaged the Confederacy off the shores of Delaware. It's really unfortunate because, as I note here, it's 90% of the way back home. It's off the shores of the United States and almost to Philadelphia, and that's where it engages. It's outgunned, obviously, 2-1, and just the Roebuck alone had 44 guns to the Confederacy's roughly 30 guns. And there's 260 officers, sailors, and Marines that are captured aboard the Confederacy. Unfortunately, well, I'll get to this in a second, what happens to most of the sailors and Marines. The illustration you're looking at was done in the 1970s by a gentleman named Hahn. He was a naval historian, an artist, and a master ship modeler. And this drawing is in the collection of Anderson House, owned by the Society of Cincinnati in Washington, D.C., where they also have a model of the Confederacy also in storage. Unfortunately, a lot of the sailors, as you might imagine, and Marines, anyone listed, wound up hapless fate, horrible fate, on the notorious HMS Jersey, which was that prison ship that we've all heard about, one of many prison ships. I think there were 6 to 8 of them. There were more there off the coast of Queens in New York Harbor. And you can see it depicted here. The Confederacy was taken back to British-held New York. Again, the engagement had taken place well off the shores of Delaware. It goes back to New York. It's considered a significant prize. Here's a quote from the significant Vice Admiral Arbuthnot. The quote is, "The rebels have suffered a great loss in this ship, as she has a very considerable quantity of clothing for the rebel army and West India produce." Arbuthnot was at that point the commander-in-chief of the North American Royal Navy. The enlisted sailors and Marines, as I said, were taken to the notorious Jersey, depicted here on the right by several artists in the 19th century. On May 14th, the Royal Navy added the Confederacy to its fleet, renaming it HMS Confederate. For some interesting reason, it got upgraded to a 40-gun ship, I guess because there were ways that they obviously had enough cannons compared to the Continental Navy, so they could easily add cannons. What's interesting is that when the ship was designed, it was designed for 36 cannons. So I guess they added 4 in some funky locations. And it sails for England. It arrives in Falmouth on July 19th, 1781. And the British, as I mentioned, are fascinated by her design, including the fact that it has these ports for its role as a galley, its secondary propulsion system. But there's the bitter truth of rot. The wood was green when the ship had been built. It didn't have time to dry, to cure, and so the ship was already not in very good shape structurally. We know exactly what it looked like, and that's why the ship modelers were able to do such a beautiful job reproducing it in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s because of these drawings. The woodwork, as it says in the Royal Admiralty records at the museum in Greenwich, England, quote, entirely unfit for the proper service. The ship strains very much. And another quote, bottom wood and very much eaten by worms. Not a good sign. Ship was declared unfit for service and was broken up in England in March of 1782. I will say I've seen another single reference that says the ship was not broken up until 1787. But whatever the case, it was no longer seen any kind of service out at sea for the Royal Navy once it was returned to England in late 1781. Harding would serve as an officer on other U.S. ships. He had prior service, of course, including famously on the Oliver Cromwell, a Connecticut state privateer. He also was on the Defense. The Confederacy is his most prominent role. But what's interesting is he's also serving as second command under Commodore Barry, arguably the co-founder of the U.S. Navy, depending on who you could argue, John Paul Jones or Commodore Barry. And they are down in the Caribbean. Barry is the Commodore in charge of the USS Alliance, one of the few ships that we have left. After the ignominious defeat of the Patriot forces under Benjamin Lincoln at Charleston, in 1780, we only really basically had 4 frigates at that point. The rest had been captured at Charleston. So the Alliance was one of those 4, and it is in, I believe it's May of 1782 that we have the last engagement. This is after Yorktown, of course, which was October 1781. So in May of 1782, the USS Alliance, under the command of Barry, with Seth Harding as his second in command, engages a British ship, and amazingly, the Confederacy is able to capture the British ship. So that is the last naval engagement. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the British ship. There is a nice legacy for Seth Harding. He moves to New York City after the war. Here's an example of what the Alliance looked like. It's also happens to be depicted on the headstone of an officer. Nope, I'm confusing that with USS Trumbull. That's another ship, but very similar depiction here, similar angle. And the Alliance was, as I note, the last Rev-War era ship of the U.S. Navy. It served until 1785, so into the early Federal era, after we had signed the peace treaty, of course, with Great Britain in 1783. And then the final slide here is just to show you the legacy of the Confederacy and Seth Harding. The fact that there are 4 large museums that have models of the ship, including the U.S. Navy Museum, the Smithsonian, the Mystic Seaport, and the Slater Museum here in Norwich. I happen to have a model here as well, as does Anderson House in Washington, D.C. My colleague Dane and I found Confederacy Cove located on old maps by the U.S. Coast Guard, and that happens to be right across from Mohegan Sun on the Thames River. And then you have 2 destroyers in the World War I era, including a USS Harding. And then I should clarify, the second one is a World War II era Gleaves class destroyer, also named for Captain Harding. And so with that, I will now open up the floor for comments and questions. And I believe also our host, Commander Fred, will say something more about my book and how the Confederacy is part of the last chapter of my first book. So
there we go. So thank you for part 2. And again, I'm showing the QR code of Damien's book, Portraits of Patriots. And you should be able to show your camera up against the QR code, and that will take you right to the website where the book is for sale via Amazon.com. Well, as you were speaking, I came up with a whole shopping list of questions. When the Confederacy first ran into storm problems on that voyage that never made it to Europe, did they tow her west, or did they row her west, or did they actually use the rowlocks that were in the design, or did they lower the whaleboats and pull her back to Martinique?
That's a great question, Fred. So based on the written descriptions, the letters, there's the Journal of Joseph Hardy, the captain of the Marines, but there's also Sarah Livingston Jay in her letters writing to her family after they arrive in Martinique. And then there's also an officer on the ship who's assisting Captain Harding, and he writes some reports. All of them are indicating no towing, no rowing. All indications are they were able to successfully jerry-rig masts to what they call the stumps of the ships of three masts. And then not sure how they handled the bowsprit, but they figured something out. And of course, the biggest challenge was that broken rudder, which they had to constantly, I guess, rechain, re-rig. And so they were able to basically slowly sail all their way down to Martinique.
That's pretty amazing, especially, the way the rudder being broken. I can conjure putting up a block and tackle and then having lines to the main deck, and then rudder right, and the folks on the port side would pull and the rudder would move to the right, and rudder left. It couldn't have been easy. And also, I know ships brought aboard lots of extra lumber, but it seems that if they had the capability of rowing, they would have taken advantage of that. It's surprising that they waited until they drifted, you say, for almost 3 weeks before they started making their way west.
Yes.
That to me is fascinating. That second battle between the British fleet and the French, who won? Were the French driven off, or did the French protect the port?
That's a good question. I don't remember the outcome.
Oh, well, something for our viewers to Google. And if you Google fast, let us know what you find in the comments box. Let's see. It's interesting that you mentioned that, when they arrived in Martinique, basically there was no bursary. There was no, you would think that even at this point early in the war, that ships of the fleet would go to sea with a bursar and money with which to pay the crew. I know, George Washington, it was a constant problem for him paying his troops. And so was this part and parcel of the same issue? Go forth and trust that someday we'll compensate you for your tireless duties?
Yeah, that's the impression that I get. And the interesting thing is that when the ship finally returns to Philadelphia in basically the summer of 1780, it's not until late summer 1780, late fall of 1780, that the USS Saratoga had captured some British ship that was heavily laden with a huge cargo of rum. And this comes up again and again in the naval documents of the American Revolution and other documents as well. The importance of capturing alcohol, the value that it would have, especially rum, and that's what would pay for a lot of the repairs to the Confederacy.
Interesting. I'm going to bring Commander Dave Winkler, our Deputy Historian General, aboard, so he has an opportunity to pose a few questions that I'm sure have come to his mind while listening to your presentation. Dave, welcome aboard.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. A great presentation, Dave. And one of the things, and you just mentioned naval documents in the American Revolution. I'm working with the University of Virginia. They're digitizing post-1778 documents. So hopefully you'll have something to work with. And also they've formed a partnership with actually a German university that's gotten a hold of the British Admiralty records from New York City. To discuss prize money, and there may be documents in there about how much did the Confederacy bring in. So there's still some rocks we can pull on this one. It's a good presentation. It sounds like your primary sources were those diaries. How'd you get access to all these, the letters and the diaries and everything? How'd you track that down?
Sure. So a couple things. First, I'll answer your question, then I'll go back to the point that you were making about the naval documents in the American Revolution. Yes. So, like I said, the journal of Captain Joseph Hardy, the captain of the Marines, is available for us to see at the archives, the research center there at Mystic Seaport Museum, about a half hour from here in Norwich. And of course, that's a prominent hub for naval historians. And so I spent several hours there looking at it, returned and made a second visit to look at it and some other related documents. The other documents and letters and so forth, a lot of it became available through websites. There's one that a lot of people I'm amazed don't know about. It's archive.org. One that is similar to it is called Hathy Trust, which is a weird name, but archive.org and Hathy Trust are very good. They were very helpful for me as I was writing my book during the pandemic, which actually turned out to be 2 books. So in 2023, I realized I had to split my big tome into half because I wasn't keeping the work down. I had 200,000 words as of September 23, and I realized, oh my goodness, that's enough for 2 books. So that's why I came out with the first book this past summer for the 250th of Bunker Hill, the 250th of the U.S. Army, and then, as we know, the Marine Corps and the Navy later this past year. So those websites were very good with the letters. Sometimes I had to go on location to look at some of the other letters in places like Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Historical Society, for example, where that was the interesting story I told in part 1. Friday, the ominous date of Friday the 13th, March 13th of 2020, as COVID is beginning to shut down the country, I had the last day to have public access at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. My wife and I went, and we went through 2 Gaylord archival boxes looking at the papers of the USS Confederacy. To go back to what's going on with the digitization process, you are absolutely correct. I'm glad you're aware of this. And I'll just say for now, without giving too much away, because I'm obviously not running the project, but I was contacted by a scholar down in works at the University of Virginia named Chris Minty. And yep. Chris Minty is one of the key people. And he reached out and he said, because of all the research you've done, I have exciting news for you. Your ship is getting digitized. You will be able to walk through. If all goes well, it will be a virtual walkthrough of the ship because of the details of the Royal Navy, of course, in 1782, but also all of the kind of research that myself and with the help of Dane Rue and others. So it's incredible, and it's again, I like to keep saying partnership and patriotism. One thing I want to mention, I forgot to mention in my talk that I'll shoehorn in through that partnership and patriotism, the role of people of colors, they say nowadays, in this case, the Native Americans, the Mohegans. So there were several Mohegans that served on the ship. Not only were they helping build the ship, because it was built on Mohegan land right across from what is modern day Mohegan Sun Casino on the Thames River, and just upriver from the Coast Guard Academy, Electric Boat, and the Groton Subbase. But also you had Marines and sailors serving on the ship that were Mohegan. And the most interesting one is this Simon Ashbow. And for people who are familiar with the Ashbow family, you're instantly going to recognize the name. His brother Samuel Ashbow was the first Native American killed in the American Revolution. He fought valiantly and was killed at Bunker Hill this past summer, June of 1775, so the 250th this past summer. Well, Simon is a Marine aboard the Confederacy, and in Hardy's diary, he says that Simon unfortunately got sick and died, and they buried him at sea off the coast of Martinique in the spring of 1780. It's quite a family, and they had other siblings who had served as patriots in the American Revolution as well. So another link with that partnership and patriotism theme.
So it's interesting. My impression has always been that by the 1770s, the colonies had developed some reasonably sound shipbuilding skills. This wasn't the first frigate or the first ship built on the U.S. coast, but from your explanation, it seems like it was done maybe on the cheap or maybe there was a sense of urgency to get her constructed, that, best practices were largely ignored. The fact that, she suffered so much damage so early in her sailing life, was that typical, or was she just not well constructed?
It's a great question, Fred. It's one that I've asked as I've done the research and the writing over the last, 6, 7, 8 years. What you're asking, and I don't have an answer. My hunch is that they just said, okay, we'll go with what's available, and as a form of punishment, if you will, we'll seize the loyalist trees, because that is in the records that they were going after land confiscated from loyalists in towns like Salem. Salem's about, say, 10 minutes west of here. There was
Right.
another gentleman's land who he was a loyalist who they seized. But given their experience, like you say, wouldn't they have said, we need to make sure we have enough wood that is going to be, cured to dry? My hunch is that they were under the gun. The clock was ticking, and they had to rush to get the boat. And out of necessity, they had to rush to build it. They didn't have time to wait for things to dry, or they hadn't thought ahead to say, hey, gee, we should have stuff ready. And I think in 1777, as they're gathering, the sawing teams going up and down the Connecticut River and other local forests, just didn't have the time to be able to have that patience to do the right thing.
Yeah, I don't recall what the normal, maybe Dave has an answer to this, the amount of time you'd let lumber cure before you used it for shipbuilding. My impression was probably at least 6 months, if not a full year, so it could dry out and take its ultimate form before you started cutting and trying to bring it into the, bending it to serve as ribs for a ship. And to take greenwood and do that, you're just asking. I mean, this is like, this is not going to turn out well. And
Right.
Remarkably, hey, it didn't. Quick question about, John Jay and his party. They made it to Europe. Do we know what ship was in Martinique to give them that ride? Did they board a French ship, or?
Another good question. It definitely was a French ship. I believe it was a frigate. I just don't know which one.
Okay. Dave, any other questions from you?
Hey, I'm good. I'm going to reach out because I'm interested in future opportunities for you to give presentations. I know the North American Society of Oceanic History is having their history conference up in New Haven in May, and certainly this would be a type of paper that they would have an interest in hearing about.
Wonderful.
Well, I'll pass you the call for papers for that is due February the 15th. So
Okay.
I'll hook you up with those folks.
Thank you.
You have to travel too far to that one.
No. New Haven, the Elm City, is where my wife and I met. Neither of us went to Yale, but our parents did, and that's how we were introduced back in 2000.
Excellent.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity then to thank you for another great presentation. And I'll also take this opportunity to invite viewers to join us next month. On 22 January, Captain Michael Lilly, who has presented twice before, has another article in the online version of Naval History that will be published this month. And he will be presenting Hawaii Prepares for the War with Japan. And that will be again on 22 January 2026. Hard to imagine 2026. Same time, 1900 Eastern Standard Time. So look forward to seeing you all then. And with that, I will wish everybody a great evening. Be well.